Sorry for the technical interruption. And all right, so let's get started. I'm going to start with a little bit of a history here. And the history is from the late 80s. So what is we know as CERN, which is in Switzerland in Geneva. It's called the European Organization for Nuclear Research. That's where the web was invented. That's where it was conceptualized and implemented. But of course, web was a new thing, but it was not the first ever approach to connect things in the world. In fact, a version of the web called the internet existed from before, in fact, from the 1960s, and it was a project by the US government. And the idea was to help scientists and government people share files with each other. So the internet has its genesis as a way to connect people and use technology as a way to support social connection. The web was different though. The way we conceptualized the web was that the creator, Tim Berners-Lee, decided to make the source code of the web platform to be open source, so available to anybody to use and adapt. And as we know, so many decades later, the web has taken a life of its own. But of course, it was not just yet another invention. The reason it was a paradigm shift is because the creators of the web knew from the beginning that, the immense power that this technology is going to have in the world in terms of governments, businesses, societies, and our daily lives. In fact, over the years, we have seen so many different web technologies play such important roles in a variety of different things in our everyday social and personal lives. We have seen social media platforms, for instance, supporting people in community building and supporting protests. We have seen how social media became that platform and a source of social connections between otherwise strangers who could come together and do big things. And my favorite example there is the Women's March of 2016. And if you know the context of the Women's March, it was one of the biggest demonstrations that ever happened at the inauguration of a US president. And it was actually started by a woman, a retired woman who in Hawaii who had no background in organizing. She had just sent a message on a Facebook group saying that wouldn't it be nice if we could all assemble together at the time of inauguration. And by the time she woke up after posting that message at night, it grew to several hundred, then thousand, and so on. As we know, it was one of the biggest demonstrations that we have seen at the inauguration of any president in the US. And then let's talk about young people. Young people, these web platforms are very much who they are. It defines who they are, what they do, and how they move forward. But at the same time, despite all of these implications of the web, the creators were also not, they were also aware the immense harms that this technology could bring to people. And I guess that prophecy came to life a few years ago when time and again we have seen how social media mis and disinformation has impacted elections in democratic countries. We have seen how there have been, for instance, incidents when private data of individuals using these platforms got leaked and caused harm to people. So this question of the benefits and harms of social media in particular is obviously not something that only the creators of the web kind of thought about and were worried about. This is something that we have seen many scholars in our very interdisciplinary areas to be asking over the years. We know time to time scholars who have talked about the positives that these platforms bring to people in terms of helping them during life transitions, helping them manage life events, giving voices to marginalized communities, and helping people, with mental health struggles find peer support. But at the same time, we also read news every day, and we hear about how platforms such as Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat are causing mental health challenges, especially in our teens. We read about horrifying news about online streaming services that are glorifying something like suicide. And we hear about the worries of parents and lawmakers about the damages that these platforms are bringing in terms of mental health impacts among youth. In fact, this challenge of the positives and negatives and these struggles and tensions between what is that role that social media plays is something that has, been in the discourse of policymakers as well. This was an advisory that was released by the U.S. Surgeon General in 2023 that I had the privilege to contribute to, and it talked about the epidemics of loneliness and isolation. And a big part of that conversation was that what is that role that social media is playing in that ecosystem? But the question is, we still don't have good answers. The question is, social media, is it really bad? Is it really good? And how do we navigate? And what is it that we need to do to move forward from here? At this point, this question is almost a question of culture war. But that aside, how do we actually bring evidence and data to bear on this question? And how do we make progress on finding an answer to this question that is grounded in the real experiences and real social media activities of the people who are being impacted by them, both positively and negatively? And what are some of the ways that we can go about looking at that evidence base so that we can hopefully make a small but important step forward in answering this question? This is a central question in the lab that I direct at Georgia Tech. This is the question that keeps us awake at night, but also motivates us to wake up in the morning, is what is that role that online technologies, broadly speaking, are playing in terms of both reflecting, but also shaping our mental health and well-being. And to do this work, we take a heavily interdisciplinary approach that centers on human experiences, that centers on data-driven insights, and borrows heavily from the social science and public health literature. I also asked this question in several different hats in my participation across interdisciplinary centers on the Georgia Tech campus, but also through concerted large research initiatives that investigate this question in a different way and bring together people from different disciplines to bear on finding answers to that. So coming back to this talk, drawing on that approach of thinking about the human experience, thinking about data, and centering on interdisciplinary approaches, in this talk, I'm going to be talking to you about a series of studies that looks at first the benefits of social media, moving on to the damages that these platforms are causing, and then why is this such a difficult question? Why is this so complicated? So we are going to ponder on this question a little bit, again, leaning on data and interdisciplinary work, and then what are some of the paths forward in terms of addressing this challenge that we are experiencing. All right, so starting with the benefits of social media. One of the unique things about social media platforms is that they serve as social pathways to care to a lot of people. A lot of people come to these platforms and they talk about really personal, very sensitive, otherwise socially stigmatizing experiences, which constitutes many mental health challenges. And they come and talk about these things to essentially a room full of strangers. And many years ago, we wanted to ask that question, what motivates people to do that? What is it that they get out of those kind of self-disclosures? And what are the benefits that we can observe in their activities on social media platforms that helps us unpack these practices a little bit more? So what we ended up doing, and the specific question that we asked is whether people who self-disclose a very sensitive mental health diagnosis, in this case, it was about psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, whether those disclosures lead to therapeutic benefits. For this, we looked at Twitter as a source of data, and we looked at public disclosures of this condition that spanned over 20,000 Twitter posts, and we looked at what these individuals who are authoring those disclosures are saying on Twitter otherwise. We adopted a set of methods from the causal inference literature, which goes to this quasi-experimental approach, and that's how it looks like. We look at the point of disclosure and we look at what happened before that, we look at what happened after that, and try to make sense of whether those differences and changes that we see in a variety of different behaviors and activities, whether those indicate some kind of therapeutic benefits. Because really, there is something that people are getting from those disclosures, because of which they are talking about these sensitive topics about their lives. So what we found is that there are indeed many therapeutic benefits that people derive from these disclosures. In this chart, you can see what a topical coherence looks like for these individuals who said that they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And what we find is that compared to the point at which they disclose, which is the vertical dotted line, the topical coherence actually improves in the aftermath of these disclosures over nearly 6 months compared to a similar time frame before. What it tells us is that topical coherence means that there are positive therapeutic aspects that people might be getting from these platforms that is helping them articulate their mental health struggles in a better way on this platform. We see other positive impacts as well. We see, for instance, after people self-disclose such a sensitive diagnosis, the readability of the content that they share improves. We see that they're using more linguistically complex phrases and words in their tweets, and we see lesser of a preoccupation with specific topics or themes, and they're not being very repeatable in the aftermath of these disclosures. And if you look at the psychotherapeutic literature, all of these are signs of improvement in mental health. When we compared these trends with a control group who did not disclose on Twitter about such sensitive mental health diagnosis, we do not see similar trends, which allows us to kind of get at sort of a quasi-experimental finding, which is that when people choose to self-disclose about a condition as sensitive as schizophrenia diagnosis on these platforms, we see positive benefits that ensue that disclosure that is not present in people who do not do that. So it goes back to this question of social pathways to care, and maybe to these individuals, these pathways, these disclosures are their ways to find meaning, support, solidarity among an audience and a set of people who otherwise are strangers to them, but maybe are able to resonate with them in meaningful ways. But this leads us to the question of the audience. Who is this audience on social media, and are they supportive? Are they helpful? How do we understand what is it about that audience that is helping people in their pursuit of a social pathway to care? So in this question, we wanted to look at, do people go to social media platforms when they have mental health struggles, looking for support, and how do we understand what the impact of that support is? So here we turned to a different platform, Reddit, and we wanted to see how when people go to these mental health support communities and disclose about their mental health struggles, how do other people on these platforms respond to that? So this is how a typical thread would look like. Somebody posts and other people respond, sometimes with uplifting messages, sometimes with solidarity, sometimes with empathy, sometimes by sharing or reciprocating what this person might be going through. But then presumably each of those types of comments serves a different purpose and impacts the person in different ways. So how do we understand the impact of those support mechanisms? So to answer that question, we again leaned on the causal inference literature, and we wanted to see through a method called propensity score matching, how specific words or phrases in those comments can causally impact the way this individual, the original poster, might be talking about mental health concerns. And what we use as a proxy here is that if there is an individual who is posting a lot on these mental health forums, goes on to post on a suicide support forum, then that would be a downturn in their mental well-being. And if they're not doing that, then can we see any causal impact of the support that they may have gotten on the mental health platforms that is abating thoughts of suicide in these individuals? So the propensity score matching framework allowed us to look at support along 6 different dimensions, which are grounded in a social science framework called the Social Support and Behavioral Code. And it quantifies social support in terms of emotional esteem, informational, instrumental, network support, and acknowledgements. And what we find is that not all support forms are the same. Although more or less, as long as people get some form of support, it does tend to help people. But there are nuances. And the nuances are, for instance, when somebody gets emotional support or esteem support or network supports, all of those social forms of support or social support that has those social elements tends to actually help people to not, have suicidal ideation posting going forward. But certain kinds of support actually do not help. For instance, acknowledgements tend to actually be harmful to people when they're shared on these platforms. But overall, what this tells us is that there are these diverse pathways to care that social media platforms provide that can have therapeutic benefits, that can be that source of peer support, solidarity that might be missing in the offline lives of these individuals. Is that a question, Sean? Yeah.
Can I ask a question now? Is that are there covariates? Do we know, for example, that these people who's searching, are people just generally searching for help? Are they going to therapists? Do we know that it's related to social media, or are they just searching in person also?
So we don't know if they are going to other places on the internet to search for help or not, but we do have some information about whether they're getting therapy or not, because some people tend to speak about that in their postings, but not everybody does. So it's, I would say, incomplete information, which is why we didn't look into it very carefully, because the absence of saying that they are not seeing a therapist doesn't mean that they're not seeing a therapist. It just means that they're not talking about seeing a therapist. So it's a little bit complex when you cannot see the other offline facet of lives of these individuals. But we did see that a lot of these individuals were actually not getting help elsewhere, which is why they were online.
Yeah, because I was thinking, is it maybe the people who are seeking out these social outlets or maybe they're also doing other things in the in-person life that's affecting, and can be disentangled.
There could be confounds like that. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Sure. All right. So we are going to turn gears a little bit and talk about the harms, because the benefits and harms complete the picture if you want to understand how is it that these platforms are impacting young people. So here I want to talk about a broad research initiative that was a collaborative effort between Vanderbilt, Boston University, and Georgia Tech, supported by an NSF grant. And within that, we collected data that was donated by young people between the ages of 13 to 18. They donated their private Instagram conversations, and they also gave us a variety of self-reported data. And the purpose of the bigger project was to understand what kind of online risks do these young people experience in these private conversations, and can we better understand those risks. But the questions I'm going to be talking to you about on that data set that's relevant to that to this talk are twofold. One of that is that their online risk is not a monolith. There are many kinds of online risks that young people experience, and one of the prominent ones is online harassment. And we know that online harassment is awful and can have a lot of negative impact on the people who experience them. But the question is, can we quantify what is the impact of these online harassment on the mental health of people who are victimized through these means? And then once people experience an online harassment, can we quantify the level or the extent of negative impact on their mental health that this incident could be having? And are there causal links that we could establish to that effect? So again, here we were drawing from the causal inference literature and on donated data from 180 of our participants, young participants. We looked at all of their private Instagram conversations with others, and we quantified the levels of mental health concerns that were discussed by our participants in those conversations, and then the nature of online harassment that they experienced in the messages that were shared from other people. The method that we used is called the difference in difference analysis, which is the idea that when there is an intervention, which is your vertical line in the middle, and you have two groups, one which has experienced the intervention and the other that has not. If you see what happens after the intervention, you're going to see an effect in the group that did have that intervention. But the idea of difference in difference is that the change that you observe in the control group and the change you observe in the intervention group, you would expect the change in the intervention group to be higher because of that intervention that they experience. So difference in difference is really about quantifying that post and pre levels of whatever your outcome of interest is so that we can quantify the causal impact of that intervention. In our case, what this means is that people have experienced, some people have experienced online harassment, which is the figure on your right. And there's a group that has not experienced, but who are demographically matched to the people who did experience online harassment. And we want to see how is it that their mental health has changed before and after this intervention compared to what the control group experienced. So we consider two kinds of controls in our control groups in our work. One was a between subject and one was a within subject control. So between subject meant these are individuals who are very similar in their demographic profiles, but did not experience an online harassment event. And then the within subject approach was the same people and their conversations on Instagram, but from a time before they experienced any harassment at all on Instagram. And what do we find? We find that for the treatment group, so this is the group that experienced harassment, there is a change in their mental health expression. And we see that that change is positive, meaning that they were talking more about mental health concerns in the aftermath of experiencing online harassment that was not present in either of these two control groups. But what is even more interesting is that if you look at the magnitude of impact, magnitude of change in the mental health expressions, it is different based on how much time after the experience of harassment you're looking at. And what we find is that every online harassment event has a persistent impact on the mental well-being of these young people. And that negative impact persists for up to a week to 2 weeks. And then after that, it tends to subside down. 2 weeks might sound like a small amount of time, but think about the types of microaggressions and the types of online harassments that a lot of young people experience online. And if each of those incidents are having a persistent, significant impact that lasts for about 2 weeks, we are, finding ourselves in a situation where we have to question about the risks that these platforms are posing to young people. But there are other questions about the harms of these platforms that also need to be considered. And that is not about necessarily the interactions with other people, but the information that people are consuming on these platforms. In this study, what we wanted to look at is that when people read misinformation and share misinformation on social media platforms, what impact does it have on their mental health? We explored this in the context of COVID misinformation, and we wanted to see for people who have shared COVID misinformation, can we see noticeable changes in their anxiety level in the aftermath of that sharing that may not be present in a control group. So here again, a drawing on the causal inference literature, we used a propensity score matching technique. And not surprisingly, we found that there was a persistent increase in the anxiety levels among people who shared COVID-19 related misinformation compared to the people who were similar in their Twitter footprints, but did not share COVID-19 misinformation. But what was even more alarming to us was this causal change in the anxiety levels for people of different sociodemographic groups. And what we found is that people who identified as individuals of color and people who had lesser of an access to education were more prominently and negatively impacted by the sharing of COVID-19 misinformation compared to people of other sociodemographic groups. In fact, we see a considerably more, about 14% more rise in anxiety levels in these groups, such as individuals identifying as Black individuals, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Hispanics compared to people who identify as white. All right, so I talked a little bit about the benefits and harms, sort of, in mutually disconnected ways. But obviously, like I said at the beginning of the talk, social media is not a monolith. So if we are thinking that there is a lot happening under the hood of these platforms, we cannot be asking questions of benefits and harms in a disjointed way. And that's what makes this question so difficult to address. Part of it is also that the question of when is social media a benefit and when is it a harm, it often not just varies by the individual, it also varies by the situations that we are in. And sometimes the nuance that we miss in these investigations is that questions of benefits and harms often boils down to the same person and their life situation, and how these platforms could be both a driver of positive mental health change, but also bring us down at the same time. So how do we get at this question, and how did we come up with that observation? This goes to, we found this answer in a mixed method study where we wanted to look at individuals with mental health struggles and the role that social technologies, especially social media, plays after they had had an adverse psychiatric episode. In this case, we were looking at psychiatric hospitalizations, which for a lot of health systems means that for these young individuals who get admitted, they do not have access to their devices, so they do not have access to social media in the time that they are an inpatient. So that means the time after they were hospitalized is an overwhelming time. It is a time when they're trying to reintegrate. It is a time when they're trying to get back to their life, their school, their friends. And there's also a lot going on in terms of how do you explain these 7 days where you are not present in these conversations with your friends online. And this is the situation where we see that social media is truly a double-edged sword for these individuals. This was a mixed method study where we used interview data and also data that was donated, Facebook data of these young people before and after these psychiatric hospitalizations. And what we found is that even for the same person, and at the same time, these platforms could be a positive and a negative. And what were some of these examples of positives and negatives? Among the positives, a lot of people felt that these platforms and technologies allowed them to reintegrate and reestablish social connections in a much easier way than it would have been otherwise. They felt that they could resume their social roles and responsibilities, and they could access information, they could connect with other peers, other people on the internet and social media who might also have undergone a psychiatric hospitalization. And that experience of having access to social media after a break, after a while, allowed them to derive meaning and allowed them to motivated sense making in their lives in terms of this very adverse episode and experience that they had. But at the same time, these individuals said that they experienced a lot of stigma. They had to explain to their friends that they were away for a week, and in a lot of cases, they couldn't explain why were they not online. If you were away, you should still have your phone. but you clearly went dark for the entire week. So what happened? And they felt a lot of stigma, they felt a lot of shame that saying anything about that adverse life experience would be negative or harmful to them. A lot of people felt that they didn't get the kind of support that they expected after this adverse life event, a lot of times because these people just didn't know what was going on. And they went on these platforms and they looked how beautifully all of their friends' lives were going on in this 7 days when they were stuck in an, as an inpatient without access to their social media. Social comparison was a huge challenge, but also emotional triggers were a huge source of harm, right? There were probably things that they found difficult out in these social media platforms, and coming back to social media meant that those triggers came back. One of our participants, this work was kind of done in the time of COVID, and one of the participants also said that they were so glad that for a week they did not have to read news about people dying of COVID. And they came back and suddenly they were bombarded with all of this information of the doom and gloom that this pandemic was having in the world. And they felt like they did not need that negativity pushed in back into their lives. So what this tells us is that this question of the benefits and harms of social media, it's not a simple dichotomy. There are a lot of complexities, there are different ways, and it really depends upon the person and their situation that defines what is harm or what is benefit. And sometimes the lines between the harms and benefits are blurred. So now the question is, what do we do about this? This is a hard problem, but just saying and calling it out as a hard problem does not solve it. How do we move forward here? I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there have been efforts by different stakeholders to address this issue. But whether those efforts have actually helped or not, that is an open question. And I'm going to unpack that through this work where it's really unclear whether interventions of certain types can be helpful to amplify the benefits and mitigate the harms of social media. So, in response to a significant public backlash, about 9 years ago, Instagram decided to moderate a bunch of pro eating disorder and pro self harm hashtags on the platform. What it meant is that you could still use one of those moderated hashtags, but if somebody else would search for them, they would not see that your post as a search result. So this was their way of saying that you can still express yourself using these hashtags, but other people will not be exposed to this content that might actually end up in harm. Sounds like a good idea, isn't it? Right? But unfortunately, it was not. This is what happened. When thigh gap was banned, the communities came up with lexical variants of the word thigh gap with two P's or thigh gap with a Y and so on. And when by the time Instagram's moderation system caught up to that, the communities had moved on to other lexical variants. These were identified through a natural language processing technique where we looked at hundreds of thousands of postings of Instagram posts. But what was hard is that automated NLP tools were always playing a catching up game to this. The communities were always ahead to come up with these variants, and the moderation platforms that relied heavily on NLP were always relying on a certain hashtag to have gone somewhat of a viral or catching enough snowball or traction. That's when it would come into the attention of these moderation tools and then eventually be banned. So this cat and mouse chase ended up making the communities look like the following. When these hashtags were banned, that is your vertical gray line, we see that in the aftermath, not only a lot of lexical variants emerged in that timeline, but some of those lexical variant hashtags actually had greater engagement in these communities than some of the original banned hashtags even had. And what this tells us is that if banning would have actually made a difference and this content moderation was a good idea, we would not be seeing an increase in engagement around these platforms. And why is that even the same level of engagement a problem? It's because as these lexical variants emerged, these communities became more insular. They became more difficult to discover and extend interventions to. So eventually, it wouldn't be wrong to say that this well-intended effort by Instagram actually made the situation much worse, as was quoted in this Wired article. But there have been other well-meaning efforts as well, which I would say that probably did have more positive impact. So let's walk through some of those. One of that is Tumblr, which surfaces public service announcements on searches of harmful, otherwise harmful hashtags that look like this. And then Facebook, for a while, has invested resources in mental health, and they have developed this AI that looks at conversations on Facebook Messenger and surfaces a variety of different interventions to help people who might need that help. Of course, all of these approaches are fraught with ethical challenges. So the question is, yes, we are doing something. These are well-intended efforts, but is that enough, or is that the right thing to do? But also there are questions of, are we adapting quickly enough? Because social media is evolving very rapidly. And social media today is getting integrated with emerging technologies such as generative AI. And the question of are we doing something is not enough, because the question often is, are we playing catch up, or are we doing something proactively to help these individuals still get the benefits of these platforms, but also protect them from harm? And one of the directions that is particularly thorny and challenging is generative AI influencing or permeating our experiences on social media platforms. In a future where, when someone goes to look for social support, which historically we know, and I talked about earlier in the presentation, can have positive benefits for people. But if now we have AI wanting to or trying to provide support to people, is that going to be a good idea? Are we actually amplifying the benefits of online social support, or are we actually creating yet another avenue for harm? And these are the hard questions that we have to keep on asking, because in this brave new world of social technologies, we have bad actors, but we also have ways in which even well-intentioned people might be harmed by the proliferation of technologies such as AI, which in the name of support could, discourage people from getting therapy, or could essentially be that sycophant friend who always agrees with you. But we know in mental health that sometimes you need that friend who is going to contradict you, who is going to tell you that what you're thinking about is wrong, or what you believe in is misleading. And if you're in a toxic relationship, you need to end that relationship. But by integrating and thinking and making these social media platforms more immersed in AI and whatever is coming next, are we eroding that valuable social connection that has been such a fundamental tenet of mental health care? And what we have seen over the course of several years now, that social media could be one avenue for people to access that social connection and that help. But are we actually introducing more harm now by trying to adapt them? So I'm going to start to wrap up, and I'm going to tell you about what I am doing in my own scholarship and my work to think about this question. And one of the avenues that I see is in terms of policy. So I had the privilege of contributing to this report by the National Academies that was a consensus report that quantified and looked at the body of research to understand the impact of social media on the mental health and well-being of young people. And one of the conclusions of that report is that it's very complex. There's a lot to unpack in this space. Social media is not unilaterally good or unilaterally bad, but it's actually a combination of the two. And we need to invest more resources, and we need to think about policy to help us move forward. And then I'm also working with the World Health Organization in a technical advisory board capacity within the Commission for Social Connection, where one of the things that we want to look at is that in this brave new world in which technology is such a central part that is mediating social connections, but also sometimes taking the place of social connections, what does it mean to amplify the benefits of what we know social connections to offer, and what is it that we need to do to mitigate the harms? Because after all, there is no denying the fact that social media has shaped the world positively or negatively over the last 15 or 20 years. And overall, it has been what it is. But the question is not to look back, but to look forward in a world in which social media is going to be there and it's gonna be intertwined with AI technologies. And the question then and the answer then is not to remove social media from our lives, but rather to look ahead and think that what is it that we need to be doing in this brave new world, in this new normal, where these technologies are such central to our lives, either positively or negatively. Because after all, what we want at the end of the day is for these technologies like social media to be meaningful to us and nourishing, and not strangling our mental health, which is a quote that one of the participants of my study once mentioned. Thank you so much.
Questions?
Hi, thanks for your great talk. I had a question about some of the ethical tensions in examining public data. It sounded like you talked about some portion of the data you've used, which is donated. We also looked at some data, which it looked like might have been just publicly accessible data, like Twitter data, Reddit data. And I'm curious what you view as sort of the ethics of using that data, given that we have people posting publicly, but on social media about very sensitive concerns. I'm particularly curious to hear how you approach getting permission to use that data. For instance, are you contacting individual tweeters? Are you contacting the communities? Like, for instance, if you scrape data from r/depression, are you asking the moderators of that subreddit? Are you asking Twitter and Reddit back in the time, of course, when Twitter was different? Can we have permission for this data? I'm just really curious about the ethics around publicly available data, but some of a very sensitive nature that people may not expect to be used for research, but is still public.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And unfortunately, there are no universally agreed upon answers to that question. So you can ask that question to every person in this room and you get a different answer. So I'm going to give you my answer, which is if you go by the book, which is the Institutional Review Board in the context of the US, if you're analyzing retrospective public data, it does not constitute human subtext research. But as you said, it is problematic because it is about people's sensitive life experiences. And even though it is public, technically speaking, whether they perceive it to be public or not is a wholly different question. So the middle ground that we have found in our work is one that centers on trust. Because I think the most important thing, especially in a world today, is what is it that we need to do as academics to build that trust with the broader communities that we work with, and what would it mean to build trust? So the way we build trust in analysis of this data is not just reduce it to getting consent to analyze that data, but actually work with these people to see what is the purpose of this research, what are we trying to achieve, and then turn the narrative from an us versus them to us in this together. And we have seen that oftentimes, at least in the context of Reddit, working with moderators goes a long way in building that trust. And I have personally developed personal connections with a lot of moderators of these communities when I was doing this research a few years ago. And I feel that it's that trust that is in some ways more important than consent, because a lot of people would be very much willing to share data with you, but only if they think that you are good stewards of that data. And that's what I think we need to invest in. Yeah.
So, as you know, it's really frustrating to know sort of like what social media, this big bucket versus some of the specific affordances within that. And I'm wondering, because you've done such a deep dive and a lot of it's large language kind of modeling, do you have a sense about some of the affordances of when like the emotional valence or the differences in posting when it's like you post it broadly. When it's like Reddit anonymous, or it's Facebook and or they donate messages where it's a direct communication, is there anything you can disentangle by the types of data you're generating that might tell us more about some of these mechanisms?
Yeah, so affordances, as you know, and we talked and we worked on that in our report together. So Stephanie is also part of that report I talked about. It is a very useful way to think about these platforms, and the commonalities that we often see are things like support that is persistent across these different platforms, whether it is support on a public forum with essentially an invisible audience, or it is support that is coming in a directed fashion from from a person in a one-on-one interaction on Instagram. We also think in terms of social capital, in terms of how different affordances might support or help people build that social capital in these platforms. And then some of the other things that we look at is that what are different ways of emotional expression, and what are the affordances that are available on these platforms for emotional expression. Like, for instance, turns out that memes are a prominent way of emotional expression for a lot of young people, which I personally do not get still. But it is what it is. And depending upon which platform that we are looking at, it's useful to look at both the affordances, but also the underlying norms of those communities in terms of how they express themselves and interact with each other.
Do you find like emotional valence, like more personal and more disclosed on like a directed communication or communication thread than like what you post? Like meme is more of a public facing.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. In fact, years ago, some of the earliest work that I did and did not talk about it here was on postpartum moms and their mental health struggles. And we compared Twitter expressions and Facebook expressions. So public data and private data, at that time you could collect it through an API with their consent. But some of the differences that we saw in that was that social interaction was a much richer signal in the Facebook context, or lack of it was a more prominent predictor of postpartum depression on Facebook rather than on Twitter, because Facebook was the place where a lot of those personal connections were, whereas Twitter was more sort of, a little bit removed from real physical world connections. But emotionality was a bigger predictor in the Twitter context compared to Facebook, where on Facebook, a lot of these moms felt that they had to self-censor the negative struggles or feelings that they were experiencing.
So thank you so much for your talk. So my question have like two part. One is that have you looked at the influencers or bloggers that gain like that have some income from the those social media, and look at it with a professional perspective? And also I saw so many like psychological studies which said that the frequency of just facing these kind of hate comments can just like make people resilient to those kind of trauma. So have you looked at those like bloggers who just receive many hate comments, and then how was their experience?
Yeah, so the first part of your question is about influencers. The moment I hear the word influencers, I realize how old I am. So thank you for that question. It is quite intriguing to me, and I have not looked at it formally, but I would like to explore that space, because let's be honest, for young people, the appeal of an influencer is much deeper than a person who's a clinician in their day job and are present on social media platforms. But I also worry in terms of the kind of advice that the influencers are providing. And I know that TikTok is one of those places where there has been in many ways a normalization of the mental health discourse. And that is a great thing. I think influencers can play that important role of making people think that it's okay to feel overwhelmed or lonely or down, and you can talk about it with other people. But also there are influencers who are taking more of an an anti-clinical stance, where they're discouraging people from getting therapy or discouraging people from adopting other sort of conventional forms of care and treatment. So it is dicey, and I think we certainly need a deeper look into understanding what is it that the influencers are saying or doing, but also importantly, the impact that it is having on young people's intent to help seeking or the lack of it. In terms of people experiencing hate, which was your second question, that's established technique within a mental health treatment, which is called exposure therapy. It's often adopted in PTSD treatment, which is the idea that the one thing that really causes difficult feelings in you, if you get familiar with that, you're exposed to that, it would actually help you build resilience. I'm not aware of that work being done in the context of online hate, and I don't even know if that's a good idea or not, but that's a useful question. I think this is one of those cases where observational data can really be helpful. Can we learn something about the impact of repeated exposures of online hate that a lot of, people on social media experience or are targeted with? And does it help them build resilience? Does it make them go more insular, stop using these platforms? And I personally anecdotally know examples on both ends of the spectrum, but whether that would pan out in a scientific study is something that we will have to find out.
Thank you.
I have a very quick question. I'm just curious about the logistical facet of the data donation part of the project. 'Cause I work with a lot of kids with rare diseases. Part of my work, I've been thinking about how data are flowing between individuals as well as between institutions, as well as systems. Down the line, if I wanted to, for example, do some work around data donation from the kids with rare diseases, how should one or team initiate that process? And what are some of the security side of the thing or ethical side of the thing that we should consider as, researcher walking to this?
Yeah. Well, I can have a much longer answer to your question, but basically, I mean, I guess in your context, is it health data that you're talking
Yeah,
about?
it's probably not social
Yeah.
media data like that I'm thinking, but I'm just curious about how you guys are taking care of that initiative.
Yeah, so it kind of varies by the project, but we kind of essentially our central idea is to use the principle of least privilege. So the idea is to house the data in a place with very limited access. Oftentimes we de-identify the data before it is accessible to any study personnel. It is behind all sorts of high security, two-factor authentication, encryption, those kinds of things. But also importantly, the human-facing side is very important, and that it goes back to my answer about being good stewards of data. And also to what I was saying at the student lunch, which is that, how do you have participants by your side? And how do you communicate that message that we are in this together? And if you are collecting data, you as a researcher, you're collecting data from participants, what is it that they get out of it? And how do you build that trust and maintain that trust over time? I mean, consent is one part of it, but also transparency, data literacy. We have created some training modules that tell these potential data donators that if you donate data, these are the things that could be learned from this data. These are the different things that it can inform and inform treatment and so on. And many times people find that, that with the technical infrastructure to protect the data encourages them to participate.
Last question, Sean?
Oh, I think there was someone up here who had.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. Good, Sean.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay, sure, sure. So yeah, so I thought it was really interesting. You mentioned the difference between like how people express themselves regarding postpartum depression on Facebook versus Twitter, and maybe possibly due to like the kinds of people that would be on Facebook versus Twitter. And that made me wonder if there's a difference in the impacts of self-disclosure and harassment on a site like Facebook, where right, your friends and family are there and they know who you are, versus something like Reddit, right, where it is more anonymous, with Twitter being somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, we certainly have looked at that question, which I didn't talk about here. Normally, when people have the affordance of anonymity, they tend to be more disinhibiting, so they're more likely to open up and talk about struggles. And this was the most stark for us in some work that we did on people who have experienced sexual abuse. And we found that a lot of the people who came to these online communities adopted anonymous identities. This was in the case of Reddit, so they adopted throwaway accounts, and they were talking about their experience of sexual harassment. It was the first time ever that they talked about this to anybody online or offline. We also saw a lot of men coming to these platforms and talking about sexual harassment, which is again something, there is so much of stigma around that. We saw a lot of queer people talking about these things. So again, the ability to use that affordance of anonymity gives people agency to talk about things or engage in a form of self-disclosure that may not be possible on platforms or in the offline context.
All right, let's continue this conversation at the reception and thank Munmun for giving us that.
Yeah,